Warlord Drakun Voss of the Crisari Horde had never once retreated in 40 years of conquest, and he did not intend to start now, except that his hands, gripping the command rail of the Bloodspire, would not stop shaking. Behind him, on the tactical display, 31 Crisari warships lay scattered and burning across the debris field of the Halvan Reach, their formation shattered in under 6 minutes by a single vessel that had not fired a single shot until the fighting was already lost. Warlord, his second, a scarred veteran named Ragos, said quietly, "The human ship is hailing us again." Drakun's throat was dry. In 4 decades of war, no enemy had ever survived long enough to hail him twice. Put it through. The voice that filled the bridge was calm, almost gentle, utterly unlike the war cries of the 40 species the Crisari Horde had crushed on their march across the Reach. Warlord Voss, this is Captain Arya Solano of the UES Prometheus. Your fleet is disabled, not destroyed. I'd like to talk about what happens next. Drakun stared at the wreckage of his invincible armada, and understood, with a cold and terrible clarity, that everything he believed about strength had been wrong. 3 days earlier, the Crisari Horde had never lost a war, because the Crisari had never fought a war they didn't choose. For 3 centuries they had swept across the Halvan Reach, exactly the way their ancestors taught them. Identify the weakest world in a system, overwhelm it before its neighbors could organize, absorb its resources, and move on before resistance could form. It was not conquest so much as harvest, and the Horde had grown fat and confident on 112 worlds, taken exactly that way. Warlord Drakun Voss had personally overseen 40 of those campaigns. He was broad-shouldered even by Crisari standards, his hide scarred silver from old battles, and he had earned his position not through birthright, but through a simple, brutal talent. He never lost. So when Horde scouts detected a lone human vessel patrolling the outer edge of the Halvan system, one ship unescorted, guarding 3 small colony worlds that together held barely 2 million souls, Drakun did not hesitate. One ship, his tactical officer Kessa reported, disbelief edging her voice. Warlord, our intelligence suggests humanity is a young spacefaring race. Their largest known warships mass a fraction of our dreadnoughts. This is not strategy. This is arrogance, or desperation, Drakun said. Either way, it changes nothing. 31 ships against 1. Signal the fleet. We advance at dawn cycle. What Drakun did not know, what no Crisari intelligence report had bothered to investigate, because the Horde had never needed to look closely at prey before, was that the vessel patrolling the Halvan Reach was not a colonial defense cutter at all. The UES, Prometheus, was humanity's newest deep space battleship, the first of an experimental class built after Earth's brutal, decades-long war against the Velmorius Ascendancy, a conflict that had taught humanity, at devastating cost, that survival sometimes required building weapons no one expected you to have. Captain Arya Solano had commanded the Prometheus through its final trials only 8 months earlier. She was young for her rank, 34, with a quiet, watchful manner that unsettled officers who mistook her calm for inexperience. She had graduated top of her class at the Fleet Academy, not because she was the most aggressive cadet, but because she was the one who always asked what the enemy wasn't showing her. 31 Crisari warships inbound, her XO, Commander Tobias Ure, reported, studying the sensor feed with visible unease. Warlord Voss's personal banner is flying on the lead vessel. Captain, our records on the Crisari Horde are thin, but every account agrees on one thing. They don't stop advancing. Not for losses, not for negotiation. They've never had to. Then today will be a new experience for them, Arya said. But no one expected what happened next. The Crisari Horde's confidence was not baseless. In 300 years, their war doctrine had been refined into something close to perfection. Overwhelming numbers, coordinated strikes, and warriors bred from birth to feel no hesitation in battle. Crisari society itself was built around a single unbending principle. Cowardice was the only true sin, and a warrior who retreated brought shame not just to himself, but to 3 generations of his bloodline. It made them terrifyingly effective conquerors. It also meant that in 3 centuries, not a single Crisari commander had ever needed to develop a plan for facing an enemy who did not break and run. Arya Solano had studied exactly that gap for 6 years. Ever since her first deployment against the Velmori had taught her that overwhelming force only worked if the enemy played by its rules. The Prometheus was not built to win a battle of attrition against 31 warships. It was built to make sure that battle never happened at all. Its hull was wrapped in an experimental adaptive plating developed from Velmori wreckage recovered at the war's end. Armor that redistributed kinetic impact across the entire ship rather than absorbing it at the point of contact, making the Prometheus nearly impervious to conventional weapons fire that would have gutted any 3 Chrysari dreadnoughts stacked together. Its weapons, meanwhile, were designed for precision rather than volume, graviton lances capable of disabling engines and weapons arrays from extreme range, long before an enemy fleet could close to a distance where its numbers actually mattered. "They'll come in formation," Arya told her bridge crew, watching the Chrysari fleet accelerate toward the Halvan Reach on the tactical display. "Tight, disciplined, expecting us to break and run the moment we understand the odds. We're not going to run. We're not going to fire first either." Tobias frowned. "Captain, with respect, if we let them close the distance..." "We're not letting them close the distance to hurt us," Arya said. "We're letting them close the distance to learn something. There's a difference, Commander, and it's the only difference that matters today." The princess had overlooked one crucial detail. Not that there was any princess among the Chrysari, but there was Kessa, Dracoon's tactical officer, who had spent her entire career believing the Horde's doctrine was simply the truth of how the universe worked. She had grown up on stories of the Halvan campaigns, memorized the fall of 11 neighboring systems before she was old enough to hold a blade, and she had never once questioned why the Horde's enemies always ran. Now, watching the single human vessel hold its ground, she felt that certainty crack for the first time. "Warlord, their ship isn't powering weapons," she reported, voice tightening. "No shield reinforcement, no evasive maneuvering. It's as though they don't believe we can hurt them at all." "Everyone believes that, until they're proven wrong," Dracoon said. "Perhaps they simply haven't learned yet. Or perhaps," Kessa said quietly, "we're the ones who haven't." Dracoon did not answer. He would remember that exchange, later, with far less certainty than he felt. In the moment the Council had made a terrible mistake aboard the Bloodspire. Warlord Dracoon Voss watched the single human vessel hold its position as his fleet closed to engagement range, and felt the first stirrings of something he hadn't experienced in 40 years of war. Uncertainty. "They're not retreating," Kessa reported. "They're not even repositioning. They're just waiting." "Bravado," Dracoon said, though the word came out less certain than he intended. "Or a malfunction. Either way, we proceed as planned. Full fleet barrage on my signal." The order went out, and 31 Chrysari dreadnoughts opened fire simultaneously, a coordinated barrage that had reduced entire planetary defense grids to slag in past campaigns, unleashed now against a single human ship that made no attempt to evade. The Prometheus took the full weight of that barrage, and did not break. On the bridge, alarms blared as the adaptive plating strained under the impact, but the hull held, energy bleeding harmlessly across its surface in cascading waves of blue-white light. Tobias stared at the damage readout in disbelief. "Captain, hull integrity at 94%, we barely felt that." "Now," Arya said quietly, "let's show them what we can do." Everything changed in the next few seconds. The Prometheus did not unleash a barrage of its own. It did something the Chrysari war doctrine had no framework for at all. It fired with surgical restraint, graviton lances lancing out one at a time, each shot targeting not hulls but engines, weapons arrays, sensor clusters, systems not lives. Within 90 seconds, 6 Chrysari dreadnoughts drifted dead in space, their crews shaken but alive. Within 4 minutes, 14 more had lost primary weapons or propulsion. The Horde fleet, so accustomed to being the hammer, had no doctrine at all for becoming the anvil. On the Bloodspire Dow's bridge, Kessa watched formation after formation collapse into drifting wreckage, and found herself, for the first time, unable to give an order. Every instinct trained into her since childhood screamed to push forward, to close the distance. to let sheer numbers finally overwhelm the single stubborn vessel that refused to run. But numbers meant nothing against an enemy who could reach out and simply switch you off ship by ship, with a patience that felt almost merciful in its precision. "They're not even trying to kill us," she said, half to herself. "They could. They're choosing not to." It was, she would realize much later, the single most frightening thing she had ever witnessed in battle. Not the destruction, but the restraint behind it. Dracoon watched his armada come apart around him, ship after ship going dark, and for the first time in his life as a warlord, he understood the shape of a fear he had spent 4 decades inflicting on others. "Signal all remaining ships to disengage," he said, voice hollow. Ragos stared at him. "Warlord, the Horde does not retreat." 3 centuries, the Horde, Dracoon said, has never fought an enemy who could have annihilated us in the first 90 seconds and chose not to. Signal the disengagement, Ragos. I would rather carry the shame of retreat than the shame of leading 31 crews to a death that taught us nothing. Nobody knew what the human was hiding. It was in the silence after the disengagement order that Captain Arya Solano opened a direct channel to the Blood Spire, and Dracoon Voss, expecting a demand for unconditional surrender, instead heard something that unsettled him more than any weapon the humans had shown. "Warlord Voss, this is Captain Arya Solano of the UES. Prometheus. Your fleet is disabled, not destroyed. I'd like to talk about what happens next." "You could have killed us all," Dracoon said, the words tasting strange in his mouth, an admission, almost a confession. 90 seconds. You had 31 ships defenseless before you and you chose restraint. Why? "Because killing your fleet wouldn't have taught the Horde anything except that we're stronger," Arya said. "And you already believe that about yourselves regarding everyone else. I'd rather you learned something new." There was a long silence on the channel. When Dracoon spoke again, his voice had lost the hard edge of command and gained something closer to genuine curiosity. "What exactly would you have us learn?" "That strength without restraint isn't strength at all," Arya said. "It's just momentum, waiting for something bigger to stop it. Today, that was us. Someday it might not be. The question is what the Horde does with that knowledge." The truth stunned the entire galaxy. The story of the Halvan Reach spread through Chrysaor space within weeks. Not through official Horde channels, which tried desperately to suppress it, but through the crews of 31 disabled warships, who had expected death and received something they had no framework for. Mercy paired with a challenge. Warlord Dracoon Voss, stripped of his command by a Horde leadership humiliated by the defeat, chose exile over execution and settled, improbably, on one of the very human colony worlds his fleet had come to conquer. He spent the following years not as a warlord, but as something the Chrysaor had never had before, a translator between 2 peoples who had learned, on opposite sides of a single battle, that overwhelming force and true strength were not the same thing at all. Captain Arya Solano was promoted to command of Earth's newly formed Deep Space Deterrence Fleet, built not to conquer, but to ensure no world within its reach would ever again face annihilation from something bigger than itself, without someone willing to stand in the way. Years later, when a young Chrysaor officer asked her why humanity had chosen mercy that day above the Halvan Reach, when total victory had been theirs for the taking, Arya gave an answer that would eventually be carved into the hull of every ship in her fleet. "Because the strongest thing a warrior can ever do," she said, "isn't winning the fight. It's making sure the fight never needed to happen again." Long after that day, historians on both sides would argue over which moment truly marked the turning point of the Halvan Reach. The barrage that failed to break the Prometheus, the disengagement order no Chrysaor had ever given before, or the quiet conversation between a captain and a warlord, who had both, in their own way, chosen to see farther than the battle in front of them. But those who had lived through it never needed the debate. They remembered only the silence after the guns stopped, and the strange, unfamiliar peace that followed it.